Hi everybody, and welcome to the final lecture of English 495, Horror Literature and Film. I want to begin by just saying thank you for a great semester. I really enjoyed having discussion forum time with you, reading your thoughts, hearing what you had to say. I feel like I learned a lot as well, so thank you very much. I'll look forward to reading your final essays. And we possibly saved the best for last, at least in my own biased opinion, because what we read this week and what we are discussing today is really one of the major new areas for study among those who are interested in the Gothic, and that is the question of transnationalism, globalization. How will these major trends affect the way we tell ghost stories and horror stories? How will they affect the way that we express our fear? If you have fear in one country or in one culture, can that easily be transmitted to another culture? Are there barriers there that we simply will not be able to cross? These are big questions, not only for the Gothic, but I think by addressing them we can make larger points about exactly how this weird, anomalous thing called globalization works. Just a kind of very brief overview, and there's a lot, probably depending on your discipline, you'll have different texts and different things that you can refer to in any kind of conversation about globalization. Essentially, globalization has always been going on in the world. There are different stages of globalization, that is, of cultures and societies interacting with one another, trading culture, trading produce, trading all kinds of different habits and things like this. So that has always been around since the beginning of time, but globalization today takes on new dimensions. It is extreme, it is hyper, it is fast, it is to a degree that has not really been experienced before. And you can think perhaps one of the best examples, the internet, which suddenly connects us instantaneously with people all over the world. And so barriers where we used to have to pay hundreds of dollars to make a phone call or thousands of dollars to travel to a place, now we can interact, trade ideas and thoughts with people from everywhere all at once from the convenience of our own homes. So that's the kind of idea of globalization, this idea that the world was big, it seemed big, and now all of a sudden it seems small, it has shrunk. So this is what Glennis Byron says, that as a result of globalization, or at least symptomatically of it, there is an ever-expanding geographic spread of the Gothic. And so essentially, the Gothic has taken on global dimensions. You see this kind of being perpetrated. People are studying things now like the Caribbean Gothic, the Canadian Gothic. Glennis Byron herself coins the term the global Gothic, which tries to unpack what it means to have a global Gothic that is not particular to any region. Previously, in this course, we have discussed things like the New England Gothic, Southern Gothic, American Gothic, British Gothic. As a result of all of that, we come back to different regional permutations of the genre. That the genre will be unique in different environments for different people in different time periods. This is the Tudor argument that what we really need to be asking is, what is terrifying to a particular people at a particular time in a particular place, rather than trying to find some overarching statement about human nature and the fear. But I think we've returned kind of to a counterpoint to Tudor. I think Byron wants us to begin to conceptualize what a Gothic would look like that was unrestrained, by local permutations, or at least that could transcend those local variances and enter into a free-floating exchange of terrifying concepts. And I've actually discussed this at some length in a book that I wrote. You can't see it, it's probably backwards. Japan and the Cosmopolitan Gothic. This came out in April, and in this book I discuss Byron's ideas, and I try to kind of play around with these ideas of a Gothic that is suddenly global. There are two ways to envision it according to what we read here in Byron's piece. The first is that perhaps the Gothic from the start was a process of cultural exchange. So even from its inception, the Gothic has been something that is reliant upon other cultural variances, the exchange of ideas between cultures. Think, for example, of Dracula. Dracula is written by someone in Ireland concerning Britain, which is also concerned with Eastern countries and the invasion of immigrants and things like this. And so because the empire at that time was expanding, suddenly we were using Eastern European folklore mixed with Irish anxieties about colonization, mixed with the fear of the colonizer, and suddenly all of these networks of influence open up for us. So one way to look at it is to say, actually, the Gothic has never been a truly regional idea, that even the American Gothic has borrowed heavily from exchanges between America and its European neighbors. The other way to look at this is that, in fact, these variations are not truly Gothic in the first place. The term Gothic is a Western-centric term. It involves a certain way of viewing the world, a certain set of tropes and ideas and beliefs that are unique to the Western world. And so when we call something like the Asian Gothic or Japanese Gothic, when we use those terms, really it's an imposition by Western culture onto a non-Western culture. It's forcing ideas that are actually specific to us onto a culture that is actually not the same and doesn't experience horror in the same way that we do. So, ultimately, I think Glenys Byron wants to say that at the end of the day, the positive side of globalization and its impact on the Gothic is that suddenly we can begin to conceptualize the growing global darkness, as she calls it in the final line of her essay. We can conceptualize it, and we can start to address what are the nightmares that are produced by a world that is shrinking. Maybe we do have a set of common anxieties now because our cultures are becoming more and more the same. Differences are being leveled as films like Hollywood's The Avengers become massively popular across the globe. Isn't that shaping the way that we fantasize about things or the way that we have our imagination work? The more we all have a central touchstone, the more my own personal nightmares are going to be shaped just like the nightmares of someone in Thailand or in Africa or in any other place. So, I am personally, in this book, I personally disagree with Byron's assessment of the situation and say it's very dangerous for us to impose these kinds of Gothic ideas onto other cultures. There's an inherent risk in that, and that we need to be careful. But I do think it's a valuable argument, and in my estimation, it's one of the most important things that are that we can debate moving forward with the Gothic from here. And who knows, maybe one day we will, get away from this global aspect and return to a more local permutation, start talking about a Johnson City Gothic. Ooh, maybe be a Milligan College Gothic. All right. So let's move on to The Ring, which I believe probably, and I may be overselling it here, but I would believe that it is probably the more terrifying film of the three that we have watched in this course. Probably some of you will be a little bit surprised at how scary it is, so I hope you watched it with a friend, with the lights on, and that you feel not too creeped out by this. Originally, The Ring was Ringu in Japan. Hideo Nakata is the director of the original film in Japan. This is part of a phenomenon that happened in the late 1900s and into the early 2000s. It was a mass period of adaptation of Japanese horror films in America. Other films like Pulse, The Grudge 2, these films were all very, very directly influenced by Japanese predecessors. The phenomenon as a whole is labeled J-horror, like the letter J dash horror. And Sam Raimi, a very famous director, Michigan State alumni, and he directed films like Spider-Man. He also did Evil Dead, the horror film. When he saw The Grudge, which is Ju-on, is the Japanese title of the film, he said, well, now the Japanese are teaching me a thing or two about horror. This was something that was really, really important in the late 1900s. So if there's anything that is, there's anything to the global Gothic phenomenon, it is probably at this moment that we see it the most heated or the most manifested in real life. Because suddenly the nightmares that were so common in Japan were becoming common in the American context, and the aesthetics have remained with us ever since. And you'll know about this. The yurei is the Japanese vengeful ghost. You can think about the dripping wet girls, the girls with the black hair over their face, so prominent in The Ring with Samara. This kind of aesthetic choice, this trope, is now everywhere. It's now kind of a part of the Gothic that we know and recognize today. And you wouldn't necessarily isolate it and say, well, that is a Japanese phenomenon. So this is part of what we're discussing here. Are we creating a singular set of nightmares that are a hybrid of American and Japanese horror? There's still differences. The Japanese horror films tend to be much slower paced, much more psychologically driven, much more open-ended, not such a clear plot, this happens, then this, then this. Whereas the American versions of the Japanese films tend to bring those things back, tend to quicken the pace, make it clear who is the monster, where do they come from, and add some American dimensions to things. But in any case, this is a collaborative enterprise that has spawned other things like K-horror, the letter K, and horror, which is Korean horror. As these things remain steadily popular, or become saturated so much that we don't even recognize them as being not part of Hollywood horror films, we can ask ourselves now, do we have a collective nightmare? A nightmare that applies across the Pacific? Do we all share that? In terms of the content of the film itself, you'll see some parallels, and I deliberately chose The Ring of the different films because I think there's some clear parallels with The Shining. Aiden and Danny are clearly interconnected with one another. and Samara as well, children have this psychic energy. There's the theme of the child who grows up too fast. Danny has to grow up before he's 10. Aiden has to kind of get his own clothes, make his food. He has to be the grown-up in the relationship. So there's something about children. They both can tap into a primal innocence, so they can see what the adults can't see. But they also have more wisdom. There's something wise in that allows them to be more mature than the supposedly mature adults of the story. There's also a lack of communication there. Aiden and Rachel do not communicate with one another. When he draws his cousin buried in the ground a week before his cousin passes away, that could have been maybe detected. Something's wrong here, but it doesn't get detected because Rachel and Aiden don't really communicate, just as Wendy and Danny have a breakdown in communication, and that kind of stalls what could have been a faster resolution to the problem. But hopefully what you can see under the surface here is an interesting transit network of nightmarish tropes. Stephen King influences Japanese film directors, who then influence American film directors, and it goes back and forth like this. And suddenly we have a genre that is much more multifaceted than it ever has been in the past. Okay, there's a didactic element to this. The Ring, you have 7 days to live. Early on in the conversation between Rachel and Aiden, he says, we don't have enough time. And really, the learning curve of this film is Rachel learning to recognize that if you knew when you were going to die, you might do things differently. You might behave differently. And this is something that is that she learns over the course of the film as she becomes more and more desperate, not only to protect herself, but ultimately to protect her son. She realizes the value of her family, the value of their relationships with one another. So she kind of learns that lesson through this imposition of you only have 7 days. Okay, so those are the big connections that I think actually tie us together, because there's something of the time frame going on in The Shining as well. But this is new. This does not happen until The Ring and until basically the late 1990s. Horror that is concerned with technology. The first line of the film, I hate TV. And then a kind of expanded theorizing about how TV is actually corrupting and ruining our minds through the kind of electro waves that are coming at us. This is something that is pivotal at defining the 1990s horror and even defining horror today, an anxiety about technology. Remember, Samara herself is the equivalent of film, right? It is her mind that burns the images onto the celluloid. And the fear is that there's no controlling it. The spread of technology has become so all-encompassing that we have no choice. We feel as though we have no choice but to make a copy and pass it on to someone else. And in Rachel's case, pass it on to our children. We must perpetuate the cycle in order to survive. Now, the only way to not do that would be self-sacrifice, but that doesn't tend to be an option on the table. It's more important for you yourself to survive by passing it on to someone else. And this is kind of the plague, the virus motif. This is something very common in Japanese horror film. The idea that technology is a virus that has really consumed us. Think about Rachel looking off of her back porch or back balcony into the other rooms in the apartment building across the street. She can see that in each room the TV is playing and people are not communicating with each other, they're simply staring at the television. So there's truth to this, that technology and especially television and film have saturated society so much that human beings no longer communicate with each other. And that was 1998 that The Ring came out. So imagine now in 2013 with Twitter, Facebook, all of these other things have really exploded in our consciousness. So the concerns of 1998 suddenly look antiquated, like, oh, they're concerned about television, isn't that quaint? TV's really, now we have TV on little things that we watch when we're walking down the street. So, a big part of this being postmodern horror, and I think we can define this as postmodern horror pretty safely, is that there are two juxtaposed ways of looking at it. The first is there's the Western detective character, that's Rachel's character. She's trying to unearth the central cause, the central evil of the film, to explain it, to hold it quite literally, and understand the cause and effect of the haunting. The problem is, as we learn quite in a startling fashion at the end of the film, in fact we have no idea what the origin of the haunting really is. It's just evil. It's just a vague, not well situated or explained evil. It isn't parental neglect. It isn't any of these other factors. It's just an inexplicable sense of dread. And that's kind of part of the postmodern, is a sense of being decentered. There's no core truth. There's no core part that you can hold on to. Everything's just kind of free-floating around. This is why the film is really about simulation rather than reality. It's about a copy of a copy of a copy, and there's no original to be found, which is somewhat ironic. You have the difference here between breeding, think about the breeding of the horses that's going on, and adoption. The difference being that breeding, you produce something new and original, and you take responsibility for that. Whereas taking something from somewhere else, it is merely a copy. It's mimicking. It's borrowing. There's something just kind of, it's a consumer process of exchange rather than one of original insight. And so here we have the passing back and forth of tapes, printing images, making copies, celluloid, digital format, everything's going back and forth, but we don't have the flesh and blood. Even at the end, it's a false sense that we're holding a physical body, but we're not actually holding the physical body we think we're holding. The evil is detached from that body. It is doing its own thing, copying, perpetuating itself. Bodies have very little to do with this horror. So I think that's the postmodern sense of dread here. That ironically, this is a film that is borrowing from Japanese horror rather than creating its own horror. Suddenly we can't even come up with our own nightmares anymore. We have to borrow them, copy them from another culture. Horror is just an endless loop of regurgitated images rather than new expressions of anxiety. And that's a new kind of approach to the horror. We've all along in this course, we've been approaching horror as though there's a genuine fear or anxiety. It is projected outward, and then we kind of handle it. We deal with it. Not so in the postmodern horror film, especially in The Ring. We don't know where it comes from, and we certainly can't deal with it. All we can do is continue to make copies and pass it on. So I hope in the discussion forum we can unpack that a little bit, talk about the implications of technology, a sense that our world has been taken over with copies rather than with originals. I think there's some interesting things to discuss. Also talk about the cultural differences, the idea of borrowing from other cultures, what's involved, what are the ethical demands of a Gothic that is truly global in nature. All right, with that being said, It has been my pleasure this semester, a true delight, and I hope you will all stay in touch with me and keep me posted on what you're doing, where you're going, and anytime you see something a little creepy or scary, I hope you'll remember this class, maybe drop me an email and say, I saw something that made me a little scared today, and I think I can now do something interesting with that. So I look forward to your final essays, and thank you again.